Chapter 5 of 30 Years a Slave, From Bondage to Freedom, the Institution of Slavery as Seen on the Plantation and in the Home of the Planter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. 30 Years a Slave, From Bondage to Freedom, the Institution of Slavery as Seen on the Plantation and in the Home of the Planter, by Lewis Hughes. Chapter 5 Freedom After Slavery. Coming North. As before stated, we arrived in Memphis on the 4th of July, 1865. My first effort as a freeman was to get something to do to sustain myself and wife and a babe of a few months that was born at the salt works. I succeeded in getting a room for us, and went to work the second day, driving a public carriage. I made enough to keep us and pay our room rent. By our economy, we managed to get on very well. I worked on, hoping to go further north, feeling somehow that it would be better for us there, when one day I ran across a man who knew my wife's mother. He said to me, "Why, your wife's mother went back up the river to Cincinnati." I knew her well, and the people to whom she belonged. This information made us eager to take steps to find her. My wife was naturally anxious to follow the clue thus obtained in hopes of finding her mother, whom she had not seen since the separation at Memphis years before. We therefore concluded to go as far as Cincinnati, at any rate, and endeavor to get some further information of mother. My wife seemed to gather new strength in learning this news of her mother, meager though it was. After a stay in Memphis of 6 weeks, we went on to Cincinnati, hopeful of meeting some, at least, of the family that, though free, in defiance of justice, had been consigned to cruel and hopeless bondage in violation of civil as well as moral law. We felt it was almost impossible that we should see any one that we ever knew, but the man had spoken so earnestly and positively regarding my mother-in-law that we were not without hope. On arriving at Cincinnati, our first inquiry was about her, my wife giving her name and description, and fortunately we came upon a colored man who said he knew of a woman answering to the name and description which my wife gave of her mother, and he directed us to the house where she was stopping. When we reached the place to which we had been directed, my wife not only found her mother, but one of her sisters. The meeting was a joyful one to us all. No mortal who has not experienced it can imagine the feeling of those who meet again after long years of enforced separation and hardship and utter ignorance of one another's condition and place of habitation. I questioned them as to when and where they had met, and how it happened that they were now together. My mother-in-law then began the following narrative. When I was sold from the Memphis trader's yard, I was bought by a man who lived not far from Memphis. I never heard of any of the children, and knew nothing as to what had become of them. After the capture of Memphis by the Union Army, the people to whom I belonged fled from their home, leaving their slaves, and the other slaveholders of the neighborhood did the same. The slaves, left to themselves, at once departed for Memphis, and I among the number. When I had been there but a short time, a call was made for nurses to go into the hospital, and after thinking of it for a few minutes, I concluded to answer the call, and was speedily installed in the work. When I had been there a short time, I found, to my great surprise and delight, my eldest daughter was also employed there. She had come to Memphis as I had, because her master's family had fled, and, hearing the call for nurses, had entered the service at once. I cannot tell my pleasure in meeting one of my children, for I had never expected to see any of them again. We continued our work in the hospital until Generals Sheridan and Grant said the city was getting too crowded with colored people. There was not room for them. Some must be removed. So, large numbers of them were sent to Cincinnati, and my daughter and I were among them. This is why you see us here together." When she had finished telling this story, my wife and I were shedding tears of joy. My sister-in-law, Mary Ellen, whom Boss bought at the same time that he bought my wife, was with us. Thus the mother and 3 daughters had met again most unexpectedly, and in a way almost miraculous. This meeting again of mother and daughters, after years of separation and many vicissitudes, was an occasion of the profoundest joy, although all were almost wholly destitute of the necessaries of life. This first evening we spent together can never be forgotten. I can see the old woman now, with bowed form and gray locks, as she gave thanks in joyful tones, yet reverent manner, for such a wonderful blessing. In Canada. We did not remain long in Cincinnati, as houses were so scarce we could not get a place to stop in. My wife's mother had but 1 room, and we could not stay there. We went on to Hamilton, but stayed there only 2 months. I worked at whatever I could get to do, whitewashing and odd jobs of any kind. The women managed to get washing to do, so that we got on very well. Our aim was when we left Memphis to get to Canada, as we regarded that as the safest place for refugees from slavery. We did not know what might come again for our injury. So, now, as we had found some of my wife's people, we were more eager to go, and as I could not get any steady work in Hamilton, we made ready to move on. We went straight to Detroit, and crossed over the river to Windsor, Canada, arriving there on Christmas, 1865. I succeeded in getting work as a porter at the Iron House, a hotel situated near the landing. Here my wife also was employed, and here we remained until spring, when, as the wages were so small in Windsor, I went over to Detroit to seek for more profitable employment. After some effort, I succeeded in securing a situation as waiter in the Biddle House, and remained there 2 years, when the manager died, and it changed hands, and, much as I disliked to make a change in my work, I found it necessary. An opportunity soon offered of a position as sailor on the steamer Saginaw, which ran from Green Bay to Escanaba in connection with the railroad. A clue to my brother William. While I was on this boat, one of the men who worked with me said to me one day, "Have you a brother, Hughes?" I said, "Yes, but I don't know anything about him. We were sold from each other when boys." "Well," said he, "I used to sail with a man whose name was Billy Hughes, and he looked just like you." I told him there were 3 boys of us, that we were sold to different parties, and that I had never seen any of my brothers since. One brother was named William, but went by the nickname of Billy. "Has this man had his forefinger cut off?" asked I. "Oh," replied he, "I don't know, Hughes, about that." "Well," said I, "this is all I remember about Billy. I accidentally chopped off his forefinger one day when we were small boys in Virginia. This is the only thing by which I could identify my brother William." Nothing more was said upon the matter, and it dropped out of my mind. I did not realize how important were the words of this man. It never occurred to me that he held the clue that might bring us together again. Work in Chicago. When the sailing season had ended, the steamer tied up at Chicago for the winter. Upon going ashore, I at once tried to get something else to do, for I could not afford to be idle a day. One of the first men I met in Chicago was my old friend and fellow servant, Thomas Bland. He was glad to see me, and told me all about his escape to Canada, and how he had met Will McGee at Niagara Falls. He was working at the Sherman House, having charge of the coat room. I told him that I had been sailing during the summer, but that the boat was now laid up, and that I was anxious for another job. He said he would try and see what he could do for me. He went to the proprietor of the hotel, Mr. Rice, and to my surprise and delight he was so fortunate as to secure me a position as porter and general utility man. My family were still at Windsor, Canada, and when I had secured this place I got leave of absence to make them a visit, and went there at once. 2 babies had been born only a day before my arrival. I had hoped to be there on the interesting occasion, but was too late. However, I was pleased to find 2 bright little girls to aid in the family greeting, which was delightful after the months of separation. My wife, her sister Mary, and her 2 children, her mother and the sister we found at Cincinnati were all still here living together. Attending night school. After a visit of 2 weeks with my family, I returned to Chicago and began my work at the Sherman House. I was full of energy and hope, and resolved to put forth every effort to make a man of myself and to earn an honest living. I saw that I needed education, and it was one of the bitterest remembrances of my servitude that I had been cheated out of this inalienable right, this immeasurable blessing. I, therefore, determined to do what was in my power to gain something of that of which I had been cruelly defrauded. Hence I entered the night school for freedmen, which had been established in the city, and faithfully attended its sessions during the months it was kept open. I settle in Milwaukee. I worked at the Sherman House until August 1868, and during this time saw many travelers and businessmen, and made some lasting friends among them. Among these was Mr. Plankinton. He seemed to take a fancy to me, and offered me a situation in the Plankinton House, soon to be opened in Milwaukee. I readily accepted it, for I was not getting a large salary, and the position which he offered promised more. The Plankinton House was opened in September, and I was placed in full charge of the coat room. And after I had been there some time, I had, in connection with my coat room duties, charge of the bell stand. My wife had charge of the waiters' rooms, a lodging house situated on 2nd Street, one door from Grand Avenue. This was a brick building that stood where the west portion of the Plankinton now stands. The 2nd floor was used as our living rooms. The 3rd and 4th floors constituted the sleeping apartments of the hotel waiters. My wife looked after these apartments, saw that they were clean, and had a general supervision of them. Begin business for myself in a small way. After the hotel had been running a little over a year, I saw there was a chance for me to make something at laundry work. I was allowed to take washing from any of the guests who desired their work done privately. In this way I worked up quite a business. I still continued my coat room duties as my wife managed the laundry work. Our laundry business increased so rapidly I deemed it best to change our quarters from 2nd Street to 216 Grand Avenue, which seemed better suited for our purpose. Here the business continued to grow until it reached proportions of which we had little idea when we began it. Meeting relatives of my old master. One day, while I was at the Plankinton, I happened to be coming through the hall, when whom should I meet but Colonel Hunting, son-in-law of old Master Jack McGee, of Mississippi. We came face to face, and I knew him at once, but he only partially recognized me. He said, "I know your face, but cannot recall your name." I said, "Don't you know? Louis McGee." He then remembered me at once. "Why," said he, "my wife, my brother, and all his family are here. There is a party of us on a pleasure trip through the North." I soon learned that they had visited at Waukesha Springs, and had been at the hotel only a few hours, waiting for the boat for Grand Haven. I hastened to bring my wife to see them, and got back with her just in time. They were already in the bus, but waited for us. We very cordially shook hands with them. They asked me why I had come so far north, and I replied that we kept traveling until we found a place where we could make a good living. They wished us success, and the bus rolled away. Finding my brother William. While I was at the Plankinton House, many of the traveling men seemingly liked to talk with me when they came to the coat room to check their things. I remember one day when conversing with one of these gentlemen, he asked all of a sudden, "Say, Hughes, have you a brother?" I answered, "Yes, I had two, but I think they are dead. I was sold from them when a mere lad." "Well," said he, "if you have a brother he is in Cleveland. There is a fellow there who is chief cook at the Forest City Hotel who looks just like you." I grew eager at these words, and put the same question to him that I did to the man on the steamer when I was sailing. "Has he one forefinger cut off?" He laughed and answered, "Well, I don't know, Hughes, about that, but I do know this. His name is Billy, and he resembles you very much. I'll tell you what I'll do. When I go back to Cleveland on my next trip, I'll look and see if that forefinger is off." Now that the second person had called my attention to the fact that there was a man in Cleveland who looked very much like me, I became deeply interested. In fact, I was so excited I could hardly do my work. I awaited the agent's return with what of patience I could command, and at last, one day, when I was least expecting him, I was greeted with these words: "Hello, Hughes, I have good news for you." I grew so excited I could hardly stand still. "Well," he said, "you told me that you had a brother whose name was William, but called Billy for short." "Yes," I said. "Did your brother Billy have his forefinger chopped off by his brother Lewis, when, as boys, they were one day playing together?" "Yes," I replied. "Then I have found your brother," he said. "I have seen the man in Cleveland, and he corroborates your story in every particular. He says that he was born in Virginia, near Charlottesville, and was owned by one John Martin." I knew now, beyond question, that this was my brother William. Words failed me to express my feelings at this news. The prospect of seeing my brother, lost so many years before, made me almost wild with joy. I thanked the agent for the interest he had taken in me, and for the invaluable and comprehensive information he had brought. He could hardly have done me a greater favor, or bound me to him by a more lasting obligation. My first step was to arrange for a leave of absence from my work, which I found no difficulty in accomplishing, and by night I was aboard the express, going to Cleveland. My excitement did not diminish as I sped on my journey, and the speed of the express was too slow for my eager anticipations. Upon reaching Cleveland, I went directly to the hotel where I was told my brother was employed, and inquired at the office for Billy Hughes. A bellboy was summoned to take me around to the department where he was. When we met, neither of us spoke for some moments. Speech is not for such occasions, but silence rather, and the rush of thoughts. When the first flash of feeling had passed, I spoke, calling him by name, and he addressed me as brother. There seemed to be no doubt on either side as to our true relationship, though the features of each had long since faded forever from the memory of the other. He took me to his house, and each of us related his story with such feelings as few can fully appreciate. He told me that he had never heard anything of our mother or brother. He went back to the old home in Virginia after the close of the rebellion, but could get no trace of her. As we related our varied experiences, the hardships, the wrongs and sorrows which we endured, and at last the coming of brighter days, we were sad, then happy. It seemed, and indeed was, wonderful that we should have met again after so long a separation. The time allotted to my visit with him passed most pleasantly, and all too quickly, and as I looked into the faces of his wife and children, I seemed to have entered a new and broader life, and one in which the joys of social intercourse had marvelously expanded. When I came to saying good bye to him, so close did I feel to him, the tie between us seemed never to have been broken. That week, so full of new experiences and emotions, can never be erased from my memory. After many promises of the maintenance of the social relations thus renewed, we parted, to take up again the burdens of life, but with new inspiration, and deeper feeling. I came back to my work with renewed vigor, and I could not but rejoice and give praise to God for the blessings that I had experienced in the years since my bondage, and especially for this partial restoration of the broken tie of kindred. I had long since learned to love Christ, and my faith in him was so firmly established that I gave him praise for each and every ray of happiness that came into my life. Growth of the laundry business. I continued the laundry work in connection with that at the hotel until 1874. I had been in the Plankinton house then 6 years and a half. The laundry business had increased to such an extent that my wife could not manage it all alone. I, therefore, gave up my position at the hotel, and went into the laundry work on a somewhat larger scale than that upon which we had been conducting it. We were still doing business at 216 Grand Avenue, and there we remained until 1876, when we removed to more commodious quarters at 713 on the avenue. But we remained there only a few months, when we removed to 134 4th Street in the rear. The establishment here was fitted up with all modern appliances, but I was not so successful as I anticipated. My losses were heavy, and though the facilities for doing the work were much better than those which we had before possessed, the location was not so accessible or inviting. We therefore went back to our former location at 713 on the avenue. Employed as a nurse. Not long after this, Dr. Douglas, a prominent physician of the city at that time, was in failing health, and, wishing a nurse, I was recommended to him for this service by a friend. I served the doctor in this capacity every night for 3 months. I then went with him to Macomb, a village in southern Mississippi, which had been, in the days of slavery, a somewhat famous resort, but which had lost its prestige and entered upon a general decline, the hotel and all its surroundings presenting the appearance of general dilapidation. I remained here with the doctor for 2 weeks, until they succeeded in getting another person to care for him. I then took a run down to New Orleans. A trip south. On this southern trip I had the opportunity of observing the condition of the country through which we passed. Many of the farms seemed neglected, the houses dilapidated or abandoned, the fields either uncultivated and overgrown with bushes, or the crops struggling with grass and weeds for the mastery, and presenting but little promise of a paying harvest. In some places the bushes and other undergrowth were 15 feet high, and the landscape was peculiar and by no means inviting. I could remember the appearance of the cotton farms in slavery days, but how changed were things I now saw. They did not look at all like those which I had been accustomed to see. Everything was dismal and uninviting. The entire country passed through in Mississippi looked like a wilderness. This deterioration was the natural result of the devastating war which had swept the country, and to the industrial revolution which followed, and to which affairs had not been adjusted. When I arrived at New Orleans I found the levee filled with fruit. Oranges and bananas were piled in masses like coal, and the scenes in this portion of the city were very different from anything one sees in the North. Among the many places of interest in the city were the cemeteries. Owing to the low level of the ground and its saturation with water, burials are seldom made in graves, but instead in tombs built of brick or marble or other stone, in which are constructed cells running back from the front and of a size and shape sufficient to admit a coffin. Then, as soon as filled, they are sealed up. These tombs contain from 2 to 6 or 8 or even more of these cells, and their general appearance from the front is not unlike that of a section of mail boxes in a post office. Other places of interest were the old French market, the public squares and gardens, the old Catholic churches, and some of the relics of slavery days in the shape of pens where slaves were exposed for sale. One of these was in the basement of the Hotel Royal, which would contain several hundred at once, and from which hundreds went to a bondage bitterer than death, and from which death was the only relief. I make nursing my regular business. I came back to Milwaukee with a new idea. I like nursing. It was my choice from childhood. Even though I had been deprived of a course of training, I felt that I was not too old to try, at least, to learn the art, or to add to what I already knew. Dr. Douglas gave me a splendid recommendation, and had some cards printed, bearing my name and address. These I distributed, and thus began the business which I have followed steadily since that time. Dr. Marks very kindly recommended me to well-known men needing the service of a nurse, and to his professional associates, and through this means, and through his continued kindness and interest, I have been almost constantly engaged in this work. I am also indebted to Drs. Fox and Spearman and other prominent physicians for recommendations which have resulted in securing me employment which has proved remunerative to me, and which seem to give entire satisfaction to the sick and their friends. This is no small part of the compensation in the difficult, often wearing, and always delicate duties of the nurse in the sick room. To every true man or woman it is one of the greatest satisfactions to have the consciousness of having been useful to his fellow beings. My duties as nurse have taken me to different parts of the state, to Chicago, to California, and to Florida, and I have thus gained no little experience, not only in my business, but in many other directions. I have endeavored, in the foregoing sketch, to give a clear and correct idea of the institution of human slavery as I witnessed and experienced it, its brutality, its degrading influence upon both master and slave, and its utter incompatibility with industrial improvement and general educational progress. Nothing has been exaggerated or set down in malice, although in the scars which I still bear upon my person, and in the wounds of spirit which will never wholly heal, there might be found a seeming excuse for such a course. Whatever of kindness was shown me during the years of my bondage, I still gratefully remember, whether it came from white master or fellow slave, and for the recognition which has been so generously accorded me since the badge of servitude was removed, I am profoundly and devoutly thankful. The End. End of Chapter 5. End of 30 Years a Slave, From Bondage to Freedom, the Institution of Slavery as Seen on the Plantation and in the Home of the Planter, by Lewis Hughes. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.